Welcome to Lecture for Research Methods. Be talking today about survey research. So the first thing you need to ask, you're trying to figure out if you want to do survey research, that is, whether or not this approach to doing research will answer your question. And so the easiest way to think about that is, well, let's talk about what kind of questions can it answer. What does it provide? It's a really good source of frequency data. If you want to know how many people do a certain thing, feel a certain way, know a certain thing, whatever, easiest way to do it is to survey, right? You find out, a number of people, percentage of people, right? And depending on if your sample is representative of some population, you can maybe be able to make some generalizations about people in a population, right? So if you just kind of want to, if your question is, gee, I wonder how many people feel this way, this is a survey is great for that. Also, if you're looking for differences among existing groups, right? Because when we do an experiment, we're creating groups. We're making people be one way or be the other way, right? We're making them different experiences. Sometimes we don't want to do that. Sometimes we can't do that, right? Because people are already in pre-existing groups. There's something different about them that we are not able to manipulate. Like if we want to know, I wonder who uses the internet more, high school seniors or first-year high school students? Is there a difference in that behavior, right? Or any difference in attitude in some existing groups? Grade, age, gender, political affiliation, whatever. But you can look at these different groups and see if they're different than each other, if they're the same as each other. And easy to do with the survey. Obviously, you can also look at the relationship between variables. Now, you can't look at causal relationships generally. I'll come back to that later. But you can do a lot of correlational stuff, right? If you look at what people say that their attitude is toward spirituality, and then you look at what's your attitude toward therapy. And you look, see, is there a correlation there? Are people who tend to be more, consider themselves to be more spiritual, are they more open to therapy or are they less open to therapy? Interesting question. Do a survey, you can find out. Anyway, you don't have to do anything to anybody, but you go out and you ask some questions of people and you look at the relationship among answers of groups of people. Right? And then related to that, one type of relationship you often look for is looking at people's attitudes in order to predict behavior. And sometimes we'll ask about how people feel about something in order to say, okay, well, what's the approval rating of the president, that kind of thing, right? And then you use that to predict if they're going to vote for them or not, which we know, looking back, when we ask questions like that in that way, we're not that good at predicting. If we get a little more specific, in the next election, how likely are you to vote for this candidate, right? Rather than just how much do you approve of this person now, how much do you like this person, right? Asking those things, some prediction. If you ask specifically about a particular behavior, we do a fairly good job of predicting, right? Those data, if we come back later and ask people, hey, who'd you vote for? It's usually consistent with what they said. Now, if we measure these other things added to, in terms of liking, respect, less predictive of behavior. But if we want to know what people are going to do, we can ask them what they're going to do. And so surveys can be used to kind of stay ahead of the curve if you want to know what's going to happen next or what people need if you're doing like a needs assessment survey. So if we were to have a counseling center at this university, would you use individual therapy, group therapy, family therapy, and rate the extent to which you use any of these? So we can use that to predict behavior, to sometimes marshal resources to be ready to meet needs. That's a valuable use of surveys. But one of the biggest questions about surveys comes from the fact that obviously it's self-reported data, right? You're not observing them, and you're not measuring heart rate or anything like that concrete. You're asking people questions, either on paper or face-to-face in an interview format, and you got to know, well, is this self-reported data? Are these self-reported data? Are they going to be valid? Are they going to mean anything? If they mean something, are they going to mean what I think they mean? And you got to consider, well, it depends on what kind of questions you're asking. And when the questions you're asking, do they know the answers? Right. So is it things that they can answer? And sometimes it's stuff like, how do you feel about the president's foreign policy toward Myanmar? People are like, I'm really in favor of it. I'm against it. But they have no idea what the president's foreign policy toward Myanmar is, right? So you got to ask them things that you know or you think they know about. And if you're not sure, you want to ask about how familiar are you with this, right? Scale of 1 to 10. And then you can ask about attitude toward it, maybe. And sometimes it'll be things that they don't know, not because of just lack of knowledge they haven't found out yet, but it's not knowable for them, right? So in terms of did your birth order, if you were first, second, third, or fourth born, significantly shape how you are as a person? Now, some individuals may think they know the answer to that question, but probably nobody really knows. Right? It takes an incredible amount of self-awareness. You have to collect a lot of personal data and sort through a lot of different variables to answer that question. Right? So when you get an answer to that question, you won't get, oh yeah, people who were third-borns are all significantly affected by it. No, you'll get people who are third-born report that they think they were significantly affected by it. Right? So you have to think about when you're interpreting this self-report data, what it means. It means that's what they said. Whether or not that's really how it was depends on if it's something that's knowable for them. Right? So asking them to explain things may or may not be knowable. Asking them, what do you like? Yeah, they usually know that. Right? What's your attitude toward this? They generally know that. We get beyond attitudes, it may be a little, excuse me, a little suspect. Can they remember the answer? So if we're asking especially about childhood stuff, so when you were a child, how often did your parents fight in front of you? They may not remember that, especially if you're expecting to get answers going back before age 4. They're probably not going to remember that, right? Because you have that blank spot in your memory for most folks before the age of 4. So you have to kind of keep in mind the temporal relationship between what you're asking and the information to be recalled. People have a hard time remembering stuff from a long time ago, unless we're talking about major things, right? Have you ever been in a plane crash? Most people can remember that. If you ask somebody, how many times have you flown in the past year? They could probably do that. If you ask people, how many vacations have you been on in your lifetime? You may not be so good at answering that, right? They maybe give you a guesstimate, but you're going to have a lot of error variance in there because people are going to guess differently. So make sure you're asking stuff that can be remembered and is likely remembered. But then even if they can remember it, even if they know, you still have the question, they're going to be honest? They're going to tell you the truth? And there are a couple reasons not to tell the truth, right? If the truth is embarrassing to them, if the truth is something that's not consistent with a socially desirable response, like, oh, how likely are you to give to charity this year? Oh, very likely, but really they're not. But they know what the right answer, what the expected answer is. So they may not be honest with you. And even if those things are a problem, you still got to wonder about, are they going to be paying attention when they're answering? Right? Especially if you have kind of a written survey, and people fill out every question, and you look at it and maybe they answered all 4. It's like, did they just go through and circle all 4s, or did they really feel 4 on all the things? And you gotta wonder. And even if they don't do that, you wonder, did they really read each question and think about each question and answer based on how they really feel? You hope so. But you certainly can't guarantee that. Like, if you've ever filled out a survey, have you ever gone and filled out a survey and you're like, the first couple questions you're doing it and you're thinking and you get kind of bored and you go whatever, and you start circling stuff? I'm not saying I have, but okay, yeah, I have. And I'm sure some of our participants probably have or will as well, which again will contribute error variance generally and noise to our data. So obviously, when designing a survey, you want to keep it short enough and interesting enough that they're going to pay attention, and you're not going to get people dozing off while completing the survey, right? In the hopes that you're going to get some valid data. So there are concerns, and there are things you can do to address these, but you have to be thoughtful about the design of your survey. So when designing a survey, a lot of things to think about. One, just the general format. You're going to do questionnaire, you're going to do interview. Generally, we do questionnaires, right? Because it's easier. Because you can mail out a bunch of questionnaires. All it costs you is postage. Interview, it's going to cost you time for each person you interview. And if you can't do all the interviews yourself, you want a large sample, now you got to pay somebody to do an interview. And if you have somebody else do it, you got to train them to ask questions in the right way. So the interviews arguably can provide better data, because less likely people are going to be just going yeah, no, what, right? They're going to be paying attention because there's somebody talking to them, and if they're not, the interviewer can pick up on that. Whereas reading a piece of paper, you can't pick up by how darkly they circled a number if they're paying attention or not. But face to face, you can pick up on those things maybe. So arguably, you get maybe better data in an interview than with a questionnaire, because you have especially if it's a well-trained interviewer. But then you got some drawbacks in interviews too, right? You got interviewer bias, where whenever you ask a question and they answer, if the interviewer, especially if it's a long answer and the interviewer doesn't write down every single word, they paraphrase. Well, whenever they paraphrase, it's potential that they could introduce their own bias and their own interpretation of what the person said, and not literally what they said, which can skew your results a bit. And the other thing is, people may be less likely to be honest in an interview than when filling out a questionnaire, because there's a greater feeling of anonymity of the questionnaire. Even with a phone interview where you're cold calling people and you don't know their name and they know you don't know their name, still having to tell, especially if you're asking about sensitive subjects, about maybe sexuality or certain attitudes about religion or politics, people are sensitive about. If you have kind of responses that may not be popular or may be uncomfortable, it's a lot easier just to write that down on a piece of paper, drop it in a box, than it is to tell somebody out loud, right, confessional style. So you may, that's kind of one of the downsides of interviews. So questionnaires, you may get more honesty, but you also may get more people not paying attention. But questionnaires are generally a lot cheaper and easier to do than interviews. But you got to make a choice. The questions you probably use a combination of types of questions, but one type you're going to use probably be fixed alternative questions. Often for categorical data, like if you ask somebody to indicate their ethnicity and you say, check which box applies to you, right? And you do that rather than saying, what's your ethnicity? Because you never know what people are going to say. And if they say something like human, like, oh, great, thanks. I didn't ask what your race was. I asked your ethnicity, and human isn't an ethnicity. But if you make them check a box, at least, and if you want to still give people freedom, you can always have your options and then other with a little line, and they can fill in a blank to let those people have their freedom if they want to write in human. But fixed alternative questions often are helpful because they force people to choose from some set of items, which makes it easier to compile data. And so, whereas if you did an open-ended question there, what's your ethnicity, and one person said Latino, and another person said Cuban American. Okay, now do you put those two in the same category or not? And then, so now you're having to make a decision about how to combine multiple pieces of data rather than having the person decide for themselves among these labels which one applies to you, right? Among these categories. So it helps cut down on some of the confusion and force people to make choices. But it also, when you cut down on choices, you cut down on variability, which for a lot of categorical data, kind of demographic stuff, doesn't matter so much. Now, when you're talking about attitude stuff, get a little different. So we're talking about maybe questions where we're asking something more along the lines of interval data. How much do you agree with this? Right? And the number of options matters, because you could, again, make this kind of fixed alternative. Are you in favor of tuition hike? Yes or no. And that's helpful because you can clearly divide people into one or two groups. But then what happens is people that are in the yes group, you may have some that are super, super in favor, and some that are just barely a yes. But they're in the same group. They're no different. And you have no way of knowing that there are these huge differences in people in that group, because you've compressed all the variability into just these two options. So generally, when you have any kind of interval data, especially when we're asking about attitudes, to have more than two options. Kind of a general rule of what you typically see between 5 and 7 options. When you have kind of a Likert type scale, to what degree to what extent do you agree with the following statement? And then you have some statement, and then not all agree to very much agree, and then all points in between. Again, 5 is kind of the fewest number of options we usually see. 7, maybe 9 is kind of pushing it. But then also you got to think, okay, do I want an odd number of options or an even number? If I got an odd number, it allows people to be neutral. And it's up to you to decide, do you want to force people to pick a side, right, other than neutrality? And it depends on your research question and what kind of data you're looking for. But something to be thinking about. And as I've kind of alluded to already, you can also ask open-ended questions. Instead of asking to what extent do you agree with the following statements, blah blah blah, you say, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about choosing the warrior as our mascot? And then a bunch of lines or one line. Give them some space to write some stuff. If you do that, you're probably going to have to do some coding, right? So you're going to have to do some more work. Right, to convert their response into something that you can do mathematical operations on, into numbers, which will be more work. But you may get richer data because if you're asking about attitudes about some proposed policy change, right? And you may ask, are you generally in favor or are you opposed? And then you may ask other things that you think are reasons people would be in favor or opposed, right? But if you ask an open-ended question, how do you feel about it? You may end up finding out there's some reasons people have for being in favor or opposed that you hadn't thought of, that you wouldn't have asked about, that you wouldn't have included as a Likert type item. So there's the advantage to opening questions. So sometimes I think a good kind of compromise here, at least in my mind, is you do a pilot test with some opening questions. Small group of people to identify, so you already have an idea of what kind of things you're looking for, but then you ask people just some opening questions, a small group of folks, and see if they add anything else to it, and you go, oh yeah, I should include that too. And then go back and use just some Likert type items because it's a lot easier to work with those data. Because the other thing you got to worry about when you use opening questions is randomness, and not randomness in terms of error variance, but random people just doing random stuff and not answering your question and just writing a soliloquy on some other thing, and you don't know what the heck to do with those data. It happens. Okay, so when writing questions, you want to write good questions, not bad questions, obviously. So some examples of questions to be cautious about: leading questions, and sometimes it can be hard to know bad questions yourself. It's hard to be objective when you're writing because you think, hey, everything I write is awesome. So it's helpful here to have a colleague, somebody else, to take a look at your survey and look for these types of things. Leading questions, wouldn't you agree that blah, blah, blah? To what extent do you agree with the following statement? Because I'm a proud American, I support whatever position you want to support, right? So you're leading people in one direction. That's a bad question because, well, one, you're going to limit your variability, and two, you're not going to get a true picture of their attitudes. Careful of social desirability. So don't ask a question that people couldn't possibly answer all values to where it'd just be really socially undesirable to say, oh yeah, I very much agree with that. We should institute the death penalty for shoplifting. Well, nobody's going to say that. So whatever you're trying to get at, word it in a way such that people could conceivably pick any answer, and that there was not pressure of kind of this clear socially desirable answer to answer one way or the other. Another one, don't ask double-barreled questions, and this is asking two questions at once. Rate the extent to which you agree to the following statement. The Cowboys are a highly talented team and deserve to be in the Super Bowl. Right? Those are two separate questions. That they're highly talented, yes or no, and that they deserve the Super Bowl, yes or no. But if you put it in one question, now people don't know what to answer. What if they feel, obviously, it's easy if they feel, oh, yes and yes to both, it's yes. If they feel no, no to both, it's no. If they feel yes to one, no to the other, what do they do? Put it in the middle? If they do that, how do you know that person's middle response is the same as somebody else who felt middle to one and middle to the other? Right? So when you ask questions, one at a time, no double-barreled. And last would just be vague or poorly worded questions. And again, this usually happens whenever you just get so familiar with your questions and your research question that you know what you're saying, but it's not getting out on the paper. So this is again where it helps to have some colleague come in and look at it and make sure that you're not writing things that might be misinterpreted or people aren't clear exactly what it is you're asking. In terms of analyzing and interpreting results, a couple things. Frequently, you can combine multiple items to form some sort of composite variable. So if we're asking about some attitude or some behavior, how much do you shop? Right? Like with most things, we'll get more stable data, more accurate, more valid data if we ask more questions about one thing. And rather than asking a bunch of questions about shopping and then looking at each one individually statistically, doing analyses on every single question, you combine them. You make a scale out of those. So, I ask questions about shopping online, ask about questions grocery shopping, ask questions about shopping at the mall, ask questions about using the credit card to buy things. Wording it different ways, all assessing one variable, spending money to consume products, right? So maybe add all your scores up from all those questions, and maybe even average. Get the average response across all those questions for one variable, right? So combining questions into one variable, which is something that's easy to do, and there are statistical techniques to make sure that when you combine questions that they do go together, right? You can do some item analysis to check on that. But that simplifies data a lot. So you may have a survey with 60 questions, and you emerge with 4 or 5 variables out of those 60 questions, and that's good. That's what you want. You don't want 60 variables, right? Okay, so you may be looking at mean differences. Again, if you're looking at usually pre-existing groups, if they're different on something that you're asking about, you can often generate correlational data, regression data, looking at the relationship between or among variables, as long as they're continuous, right? In general, you don't use surveys for cause and effect, right? You don't. Unless you could ask people different questions worded differently, right? So that could be part of your study. It's a survey/experiment here, where maybe you're asking one group the questions with kind of leading questions, and the other group without leading questions. If you do that, you've basically manipulated your survey, right, to be your independent variable. Like how you ask questions was the independent variable, with leading questions, without leading questions, to then see are there differences in attitudes. If you do that, then yeah, you can do cause effect. But you can only do cause effect if you've manipulated something. And that typically only happens if you give people different types of questions, different sets of questions. Otherwise, we ask people about this attitude and this attitude, and we find a correlation. You can't say, oh well, having this attitude causes people to do this behavior or causes them to have this attitude. You can't say that because we didn't manipulate it, right? Okay, that's all for now. Take care.